The Middle Ages is an era we often romanticize, imagining knights, ladies, and noble deeds. However, the everyday reality for common people was very different, harsh, dirty, and ruthless. This story immerses you in the grim truth of feudal society through the fate of a woman forced to lead young girls into the cruel and humiliating ritual of the rite of the first night. By using an unusual second person narration, the author reveals the details of a life without heroism or hope, only an endless repetition of fear, violence, and survival. But before you get comfortable, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'm very curious to see who's joined us today. Now, make yourself comfortable. We're about to begin. You were born at midnight. It was not a poetic midnight, illuminated by a gentle moon. It was a midnight choked by thick smoke from a dying hearth, soot-covered walls reflecting only shadows. It was a midnight haunted by howling dogs and screams of distant drunks, a midnight marked only by misery and neglect. Your mother's cries were not special, not unusual, just another agony amid the thousand pains of your village. She died quietly 3 days later, in silence rather than in tears. No priest came to give her absolution, and no doctor appeared to offer cures. No one wanted to risk stepping into the disease-infested hovel that was your home. It was not childbirth that killed her, you would later discover, but neglect. Her body poisoned itself slowly, and she faded unnoticed. By the time you could stand upright, your childhood was no longer your own. Life was never meant for children. Anyway, not in your world. Your earliest memories were tied to smells rather than sights. The sour scent of goat dung, the acrid odor of burning hair from animals butchered carelessly, and always the stench of unwashed bodies pressed close together. You learned quickly how to navigate the darkness, how to hide beneath your father's heavy cloak to escape blows when he came home drunk and furious. You learned silence before speech and learned survival before play. Your sister was not as lucky. You watched her waste away, her tiny body shrinking day by day beneath tattered rags, her voice reduced to whimpers. Cholera took her, but it was hunger and indifference that killed her. They buried her shallowly near the pigsty, and within days, even her small grave disappeared beneath trampling feet and rain-washed mud. Your brother drowned soon after, in a shallow stream barely deep enough to wet his knees. No one knew how to swim, for no one had ever learned. Why waste time teaching children such useless things? Your father scoffed. The villagers found him face down, tangled in reeds, pale and swollen. Your father cried briefly, but mostly because he had lost hands that could work, arms that could carry. You learned to grieve silently, unseen, knowing there was no time for sorrow. By 12, you were older than your years allowed. Villagers began looking at you differently. Men with greedy, appraising eyes, women with narrowed suspicion. Your life was no longer your own, your body already considered communal property, to be discussed around mugs of watered ale and whispered about it in barns. You were spoken of as livestock, assessed by weight and strength, hips and teeth, fertility and obedience. At 14, the lord of the manor noticed you. It wasn't a flattering distinction, it was a dreadful omen. In your village, as in countless others, across the muddy, miserable landscape you called home, there existed a law, an ancient, hideous tradition known as jus primae noctis, the Lord's right to the bride's first night. You didn't understand the Latin words, but you knew exactly what they meant. You had seen the aftermath in hollow eyes and pale faces of girls barely older than you, bruises poorly hidden beneath their rough shawls. You had heard mothers whisper warnings and fathers curse impotently into their cups. The first time you watched one of these grim rituals unfold, it was from the shadow of a stable door. You saw your friend, Eliza, just 15, led trembling toward the Lord's house, her mother crying quietly behind closed shutters, her father's fists clenched uselessly. You saw how she walked, head down, feet dragging through the muck, her dress already filthy, before she reached the threshold. She did not scream or protest. She moved toward the house as if sleepwalking. That night you heard her sobs mingling with the wind, and by morning Eliza returned changed, not only physically, but in spirit, her eyes empty, her voice muted forever. Soon after, you learned your fate was entwined with hers in ways you hadn't anticipated. The old woman named Katerina, whose shadow you always dreaded to see approaching, appeared at your door one morning, bringing a foul smelling ointment and a faded red cloth. Come, she said, not gently, not with sympathy, but as a command. You must learn. You followed obediently, feet sinking in mud, heart sinking lower still. She taught you how to apply salves, how to braid hair tightly so it would not tangle and struggle, how to prepare infusions that numbed fear but never memory. You washed dresses stained with blood and dirt, listened to the muffled sounds behind closed doors, and waited silently, your breath held, until it was over. Katerina never smiled, never spoke comfortingly. She simply taught you tasks as mundane and practical as milking goats or cleaning pots. You learned her art, if it could be called that, without pride or satisfaction. Her face was wrinkled and harsh, marked by decades of witnessing horrors, and you knew, without being told, that your face would soon mirror hers. One morning, Katerina did not wake up. Her death caused no mourning, just brief irritation from the Lord at losing a useful tool. Before nightfall, you found yourself summoned again, standing before the Lord's heavy oak doors, heart thudding, hands trembling. You will replace her, he said without preamble, not bothering to glance at you directly. You were not asked. You were not consulted. You were told. You nodded quietly, knowing refusal meant worse than death. Your life, you understood now, was never meant for your happiness, for your dreams, or even for your misery alone. It was meant solely for the maintenance of traditions you despised, laws you feared, and men whose whims you endured. That night, when you returned home, you lay awake on straw-filled sacks, eyes fixed on rotting beams above your head, understanding finally what Katerina must have known all those years. that survival was the cruelest curse, harsher even than death. From that night onward, you ceased to be just another victim. Instead, you became part of the machinery, complicit yet trapped, leading terrified girls toward a fate you once feared for yourself. You were no longer just a girl born at the wrong time. You became the wrong time itself, a living embodiment of all you wished you could escape. You closed your eyes, knowing sleep would never bring peace, and that your waking hours would bring only the repetition of horrors you could neither change nor avoid. But you would endure, because endurance was the only thing you had ever truly learned. It was the night you turned 15 when you truly became Katerina's replacement. Not by choice, certainly not by desire, but by a grim inevitability as sure and final as death. The villagers stopped calling you by name and began referring to you simply as the girl who leads. The title was both cruelly vague and painfully precise. Your duties began the very next dawn, cold and mist laden, with a visit to the tiny, soot darkened hut of yet another trembling bride to be. Her name was Anne, 14 and terrified, eyes wide and glassy, like a calf awaiting slaughter. Anne's mother stood silently in the doorway, eyes red rimmed but dry. She had no tears left to shed. They all knew their place in the ritual: mother, daughter, and you, the accomplice, the unwilling shepherd of misery. You approached Anne carefully, as Katerina had shown you, and whispered meaningless comforts as you braided her long, tangled hair. You murmured words about courage and strength, lies you both understood, yet pretended to believe. Your fingers shook at first, still unused to the rhythm of calm deceit, but soon they moved mechanically, indifferent to the quiet whimpers Anne could not hold back. You coated her skin with greasy ointment, foul smelling, thick, cloying. It was supposed to mask fear, to numb pain, but you knew better. It did nothing more than add another indignity to what awaited. You wrapped her in the faded red cloak, symbolizing innocence soon to be shattered. She never asked questions. No one ever did. Perhaps they feared the answers even more than silence. When you led Anne through the village, the morning sun barely lit the mud splattered path beneath your feet. The air was heavy with fog, as if nature itself tried in vain to obscure the shameful journey. Villagers peeked cautiously through cracked doors and shuttered windows. No one stepped outside. They knew their roles too: spectators who witnessed yet pretended not to see. Anne stumbled several times, her small feet sinking into thick mud. Each time you steadied her gently, feeling guilty for offering such false kindness. You passed the baker's hut, the smithy's shack, the tavern, each building a silent witness, each inhabited by those who accepted this horror as the price of survival. They would later curse you behind your back, whispering that you were a witch, a traitor to your own kind. Yet none of them would ever dare refuse the Lord's command either. Cowardice bound you all. When you arrived at the Lord's grim stone manor, Anne's trembling had become uncontrollable. You felt her fingers gripping your sleeve, desperate and pleading, but you dared not meet her gaze. You understood by now that looking into those frightened eyes would break you entirely. Instead, You focused on small, meaningless tasks: the straightening of cloth, the arrangement of flowers you knew would soon lie trampled, anything to avoid confronting the terror that reflected your own lost innocence. Inside, the manor was cold, smelling of dampness, rust, and old wine. In the central chamber waited a bed draped in faded silk, stained and discolored from years of use. You laid Anne down carefully, mechanically adjusting her garments, arranging her pale limbs just so, as Katerina had trained you. You must be quiet, you whispered gently, brushing Anne's forehead, damp with sweat. She nodded once, obedient and broken, her breath shallow with dread. Then, as always, you retreated silently, closing the heavy oak door behind you. You sat outside, leaning against cold stone walls, your ears unwillingly catching fragments of muffled cries, brief and sharp. You wanted to cover your ears, to block out the terrible sounds, but you could not. It was your burden to hear, your punishment to witness indirectly what you enabled. Minutes stretched agonizingly into hours. Your heart grew heavier each moment, yet never heavy enough to stop. When finally the door reopened, Anne staggered out silently, eyes lowered, her face drained of color. You took her hands softly, leading her back toward the village, your heart twisting at her fragile steps. You never spoke afterward, never mentioned what happened behind those doors. Silence was your only mercy, as insufficient as it was. Returning home that night, you scrubbed your hands raw, as if the guilt could be washed away by harsh soap and ice cold water. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams filled with accusing eyes, whispers calling you traitor, witch, demon. But morning always came again, and you rose from your nightmares to repeat the cycle anew. As days bled into weeks, and weeks into months, your rituals became a dreadful routine. There was Isabel, 17 and defiant, who screamed curses as you braided her hair, and who afterward never spoke again. There was Maria, 13, who fainted in your arms before even reaching the manor gate. You carried her gently inside, hating yourself for such false compassion. Every girl became another grim story, each name a bitter memory etched permanently into your mind. You grew adept at preparing soothing teas that dulled minds and senses, though never enough. You learned how to mend torn clothing, how to mask bruises and clean blood, how to comfort mothers who silently despised you, yet secretly thanked you for keeping their daughters alive. Months passed, and your heart hardened by necessity, though never completely. You watched girls grow thinner, paler, darker eyed, transformed from children to ghosts before your eyes. Some recovered, married village boys, bore children of their own. Others faded away, dying from childbirth, fever, or simply despair. You marked their graves silently, knowing your hands, though clean, carried invisible stains. Then came the day a new assistant appeared, another frightened girl named Martha, barely 14, sent to learn your miserable trade. You saw the fear in her eyes, saw yourself reflected in her trembling lips. You taught her carefully, methodically, as Katerina once taught you, yet you never spoke harshly. You showed her quiet mercy, knowing too well the cruelty of your shared role. You must be strong, you said softly to Martha one evening after leading another silent, broken girl home. Not for them, not for the Lord, but for yourself. It's the only strength they can't take. But as the words left your lips, you knew they were empty. That strength meant nothing here, in this endless repetition of horror. You had seen enough to know the terrible truth. There was no escape, no redemption, no dignity, only endurance. And yet, you carried on, day after relentless day, washing dresses, braiding hair, preparing bodies and minds for rituals you despised, trapped forever between complicity and powerlessness. You had become exactly what Katerina once was: hated, pitied, indispensable, forever caught between victim and executioner. You had indeed seen enough, yet you knew grimly, with bitter certainty, that this was only the beginning. Days turned into seasons, seasons blurred into years, and now you were no longer merely Katerina's replacement. Now, fully and irrevocably, you were the leading woman of the ritual, a crucial piece of the unending misery your village called tradition. There was no pride in this distinction, no honor to balance the weight of the daily horrors you facilitated. You carried out your grim duties with a mechanical efficiency that masked the hollow emptiness growing steadily within you. Each ritual began exactly the same way. You woke before dawn in the same dank hut, to the same bitter cold that clawed at your bones. You dressed silently in garments stained by years of blood and dirt. There was no sense in washing them thoroughly. Tomorrow's ritual would merely soil them again. Then you stepped out into the chilled darkness and walked slowly through mud that never dried toward yet another frightened girl's door. On this morning, the girl's name was Johanna. You found her mother already weeping, eyes glazed with helpless grief. Her father stood sullenly in the shadows, refusing to meet your gaze. Johanna herself sat quietly, stiffly upright, as though movement might somehow hasten the horror she faced. You had stopped counting how many Johannas had passed through your hands, their faces blurred together over the years, faces twisted with fear, resignation, hatred, or despair. Your fingers moved automatically through Johanna's thick hair, weaving the tight braids that symbolized readiness. Your touch was gentle, routine, meaningless in its kindness. Will it hurt? Johanna asked quietly, voice trembling. You paused, fingers momentarily frozen. The honest answer sat bitterly on your tongue, but you swallowed it back, knowing truth was no mercy here. It will pass, you murmured instead. It always passes. Johanna nodded silently, accepting the vague comfort as though it were scripture. Outside, villagers had already gathered silently, lined along the muddy paths, eyes averted, each face fixed in carefully maintained neutrality. Mothers clutched small children to their chests, whispering quiet warnings about obedience and silence. Fathers stared blankly, unwilling to admit their own impotence. They blamed you, hated you, feared you, but they would never dare defy the Lord. You led Johanna slowly toward the manor, her feet dragging through the thick mud. Her breathing quickened with every step closer to the heavy stone walls, her body trembling beneath your steadying hand. The manor loomed large, oppressive and cold, its stone facade damp and streaked by rain, standing as an eternal monument to power that crushed the weak beneath it. Inside, servants scurried silently, avoiding your eyes. You had become a ghost here, an invisible yet ever present figure of fear and necessity. The chamber waited, heavy oak doors slightly ajar, exposing a familiar bed draped in faded silks. You carefully seated Johanna on its edge, adjusting her robe mechanically, arranging limbs and clothing with practiced precision. Close your eyes, you instructed softly, brushing damp hair from her forehead. It helps. You retreated quietly to the corridor, shutting the door firmly behind you. It was your duty to wait, to witness silently from the outside, though never to intervene. The stone walls felt colder each time you stood there, your heart heavier, the ritual more unbearably mundane. Some girls sobbed loudly behind those doors. Others suffered in stoic silence. Johanna did not scream, nor did she cry. You heard only a series of quiet gasps, muffled and controlled, suggesting a willful detachment that stabbed deeper into your chest than any scream ever could. She was attempting to preserve her dignity, a courage you had long lost the strength to envy. When finally the door opened, the Lord emerged, indifferent, his eyes sliding past you as though you were a piece of furniture. You slipped silently back inside, finding Johanna pale and motionless on the bed. You gently helped her rise, covering bruises and marks swiftly and skillfully, draping her carefully again in the faded red cloak. You led her back outside into the now bright morning, avoiding the eyes of villagers who pretended not to stare. Johanna did not speak, and you offered no words of empty comfort. There was nothing left to say. Once home, your work continued, relentless and mundane. You washed the soiled garments in icy water, scrubbing until your fingers were numb and red. Each stain, blood, tears, fear, was both evidence and accusation. You brewed bitter medicinal teas, delivered quietly through village doorways, remedies that dulled pain but never healed deeper wounds. Your skill grew out of cruel necessity rather than compassion, and the villagers relied on your strange mercy even as they despised you. Every month brought new Johannas, new Mariahs, new Isabels, names interchangeable, yet each a unique tragedy etched permanently into your weary memory. You learned to anticipate the different ways they broke. Some became silent and hollow, barely more than shadows of themselves. Others, defiant and angry, were swiftly worn down by cold reality. A few did not survive at all, bodies buried quickly and without ceremony, as if erasure from memory might erase the shame of their existence. One evening, you found yourself beside yet another shallow grave, burying a blood-stained cloth that once belonged to a girl whose name you had already forgotten. The earth was frozen, unyielding, punishing your attempts at digging. You struck again and again, tears mingling silently with sweat, your hands blistered and raw. Returning home late, you found Martha waiting. She had grown older, her face prematurely lined by years of witnessing horror at your side. She spoke quietly, voice devoid of emotion. Is it always like this? Yes, you answered without hesitation, unwilling to lie. It never changes. She lowered her gaze, understanding that she too was trapped, sentenced to witness forever the misery she once endured. You felt briefly guilty for passing down your legacy of despair, but this too had become routine, another part of the endless cycle. You knew that tomorrow you would rise again before dawn, repeating rituals ingrained so deeply into your body and mind that you had become indistinguishable from them. You were neither villain nor victim, neither savior nor tormentor. You were simply a cog in a machine older and crueler than any living memory. As you lay awake that night, staring into darkness, you imagined briefly the possibility of escape. You considered abandoning everything, fleeing into the night, leaving the village, the manor, the rituals behind. But deep down, you knew you would never leave. The horror you facilitated had become part of your blood, your bones, your identity. You were now the woman who led. Your role was unchangeable, your fate sealed by tradition, indifference, and fear. And tomorrow, inevitably, you would wake again to continue guiding terrified girls through doors you would never enter yourself, perpetuating a nightmare you could neither prevent nor escape. Your life had long ceased to be your own. It belonged to the ritual, the manner, and the endless cycle of sorrow you knew would never, ever break. Years crawled by slowly, each season blending into the next in a haze of repetitive misery. Time, which others said healed all wounds, had done nothing for you. Instead, it etched deeper lines into your face and harsher scars upon your spirit. Your reputation became fixed in whispers and stares, the woman who leads, a name that had come to define your very existence. Your lord, once strong and fearsome, grew old, frail, and increasingly bitter. His hair whitened and thinned, his hands trembled constantly, and his voice became a rasping croak. Yet age did nothing to temper his cruelty. He continued to summon village girls, though now they emerged from his chambers pale with disgust rather than bruised by strength. One bleak afternoon, standing at your hut's entrance, you saw a group of girls pass, laughing lightly as only youth allowed. Among them was a girl named Agnes, barely 14. You remembered clearly the day you had led her mother through those same terrible doors years ago. Agnes's mother, quiet and withdrawn ever since, caught your gaze briefly from across the village square, eyes filled with accusation. You had become a specter haunting generations. But your lord was weakening, and soon his son, young and arrogant, began assuming his father's role. He was equally cruel, but filled with youthful energy, a danger more unpredictable and violent. Girls who had learned resignation under his father now again learned fresh terror. Your presence was still required. You were forced to adapt to new methods of damage control, hiding bruises more severe, preparing stronger numbing tinctures, managing increasingly volatile aftermaths. Yet, despite your efforts, There were incidents you couldn't control. One winter evening, a girl named Clara fought back fiercely. She scratched and bit, her screams echoing through corridors usually haunted only by silence and whimpers. When you finally reached her afterward, she was battered, barely conscious, her face swollen and bleeding. As you carefully cleaned her wounds, your own fingers shook. You knew she would carry the scars forever, just as you carried yours, invisible yet equally permanent. Clara's mother met you the next day, pale with rage and grief. She cursed you openly in the marketplace, calling you witch, traitor, devil. No one stepped forward to defend you. Their silent complicity deepened your isolation. You absorbed her curses quietly, knowing her pain and hatred were justified. You were both victim and perpetrator, forever caught between two unbearable truths. There were other tragedies, too. A young woman named Greta vanished one morning. Later, they found her hanging lifeless from the rafters of her father's barn. The villagers buried her hastily, whispering superstitious fears rather than truths. Her family moved away soon afterward, driven out not by violence, but by shame. You knew her fate was no accident. She had chosen the only escape left to her. Another, Emma, smothered her newborn child, unable to bear seeing the cycle repeat itself. You had been the one called to attend her afterward, finding her hysterical, sobbing uncontrollably over the small, lifeless bundle. Her family tried to hush it up, but rumors spread swiftly. You watched silently as the villagers whispered accusations, not toward their lord, but toward the broken girl who could bear no more. You sought comfort once from the village priest. You confessed your guilt, your fears, your shame, hoping for redemption or absolution. Instead, he stared at you blankly, murmuring words devoid of empathy or meaning. You saw in his eyes a familiar shadow, fear, resignation, impotence. You understood then that even religion had abandoned you. The church was as powerless and complicit as everyone else. One evening, you were summoned by the lady of the manor herself. Her chambers were warm and perfumed, the very air dripping with luxury you'd never known. But her eyes were cold and distant, a woman who had learned long ago to look away. You must stop coming to me, she said sharply. I can't hear this anymore. You bowed your head silently, understanding she preferred blindness to complicity. Her husband's cruelties, her son's violence, all these she had chosen never to see, even as she benefited from their status and power. You left quietly, knowing better than to seek comfort again from those who refused to acknowledge their own guilt. Sleep abandoned you entirely. Nightmares became your only companions, filled with ghostly faces, screams, and whispered curses. By day, you continued your rituals, preparing girls, braiding hair, cleaning wounds. By night, you lay awake, replaying every moment of horror, trapped eternally in memories that refused to fade. Occasionally, villagers whispered quietly about rebellion, about refusing the Lord's summons, but their courage faded quickly at the mere shadow of punishment. Fear had carved deep grooves into the hearts of everyone, and none dared stand openly against tradition. You became a scapegoat, bearing hatred and guilt that belonged to an entire village, while they pretended ignorance, helplessness, or innocence. On a bitterly cold evening, your assistant Martha quietly asked you, "Have you ever thought of running away?" You looked at her, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Where could we possibly go? Wansansansan. Her silence was the only reply necessary. You both knew that no village, no town, no city was free from horrors like this. Jus prime noctis was not unique to your home. It was everywhere, a poison woven into the fabric of existence itself. Your body grew older, your hair gray and brittle, your skin wrinkled by harsh winds, relentless labor, and endless sorrow. Girls you'd once guided now had daughters who would soon need guiding. A bitter cycle, endlessly repeating. Each passing year confirmed your worst fears. You had changed nothing, prevented nothing. The horror continued unabated, unchallenged, unstoppable. Yet somewhere deep within, a small, stubborn piece of you still dreamed of escape, justice, retribution. You imagined striking down the Lord, burning the manor, freeing the girls. But you knew these fantasies would remain exactly that, dreams. Reality allowed no such heroism. Reality demanded obedience, silence, and complicity. One day you caught a glimpse of your reflection in a water barrel, thin, haggard, pale. You barely recognized yourself. You'd lived your entire life in service to a system built upon cruelty and exploitation. Yet what had it earned you? Hatred from your village, contempt from the manor, nightmares that never ceased, and guilt heavier than iron chains. Your life had become a bleak, repetitive nothingness. The future promised no change, only more of the same. New girls, new horrors, old sorrows endlessly repeating. You were weary, so weary, yet forced to continue because no one else would. In the quiet solitude of your hut that night, staring into darkness, you finally accepted the bitter truth you'd long avoided. You had changed nothing, prevented nothing, improved nothing. You were merely a small, disposable piece in a cruel game older than memory. Yet, knowing all this, understanding fully your helplessness, you would still rise again at dawn tomorrow and lead another frightened girl toward the inevitable. Because despite all your pain, your shame, your exhaustion, you knew no other way. You changed nothing, and tomorrow you would change nothing again. Age crept upon you with a slow, merciless inevitability. Your body, now frail and bent, had become a burden, bones aching, joints swollen, eyes clouded. Villagers still avoided your gaze, whispering fearfully as you passed. They called you witch openly now, a word spat with contempt, though their own daughters still needed your comfort on those dark, dreaded days. Children threw stones, their laughter sharp and cruel, echoing through village streets. Mothers scolded them quietly, yet never harshly enough to truly stop the attacks. You bore these humiliations silently, recognizing each stone as payment for years spent guiding countless innocent girls into torment. Perhaps you deserved this cruelty, this unending punishment. Yet, as reviled as you were, desperate mothers continued seeking your guidance. They slipped quietly into your hut at night, begging softly for tinctures to numb their daughter's fears, to dull inevitable pain. They loathed you and needed you equally, a contradiction they never admitted aloud. Your lord had long since perished, dragged from his bed by peasants whose anger finally outweighed fear. His son met a similar fate shortly after, his cruelty remembered bitterly. Yet, even without masters to enforce it, the ritual lingered, a grotesque tradition etched too deeply into village life to vanish entirely. Now, younger, lesser men took up the mantle, continuing the ritual secretly, quietly, without law, without right, but with grim regularity. On one particularly cold evening, you prepared for yet another journey, your last, though you did not yet know it. The girl, barely 13, trembled beneath your hands. Her name was Anna, quiet and thoughtful, already resigned. Her eyes studied you carefully as you braided her hair, gentle yet firm. "You're not a witch," she said suddenly, voice soft but certain. You paused, surprised by her words, unsure how to respond. No one had shown kindness to you in decades. You continued braiding silently, avoiding her gaze, afraid your emotions might betray you. "It isn't your fault," Anna whispered again, squeezing your wrinkled hands gently. Her words pierced deeply, unsettling the careful numbness you'd built over years. You led Anna slowly toward the old manor, now crumbling, dark, nearly abandoned. The halls echoed emptily, memories lurking in shadows. This was a ritual reduced to pathetic mockery, performed by weak men clinging desperately to traditions whose purpose had long been lost. You waited outside as always, listening quietly. This time, Anna did not cry, nor scream, only silence emerged from behind those doors. When it ended, she emerged pale yet dignified, meeting your eyes with quiet strength. Something in her gaze told you clearly it was finished, finally finished. Returning to your hut that night, you felt your strength fading rapidly, as though Anna had quietly taken the burden from you. You lay down on your thin straw mattress, staring into darkness, chest tightening with exhaustion and age. Death approached slowly, calmly, without drama. You were alone, as you had always been. No family, no friends, only memories filled with sorrow and guilt. You breathed shallowly, waiting quietly as the room grew colder around you. In those final moments, no regrets troubled you. You had long since paid your price in guilt and suffering. Days later, villagers discovered your body. They buried you hastily in an unmarked grave near the forest's edge, afraid your supposed curse might linger. There was no mourning, only whispered relief, relief that their scapegoat, their witch, was finally gone. Yet even death brought no true escape. Years passed, and slowly your story transformed. No longer simply the woman who led girls to their torment, you became legend, a figure shrouded in mystery and superstition. Children whispered your name around hearth fires, telling tales that twisted your deeds into something sinister, powerful, and supernatural. She was the witch who led girls to the devil himself, villagers murmured fearfully. They embellished your story with dark spells, curses, powers drawn from shadows. The truth that you were merely a woman trapped by cruelty and tradition faded completely. You became a cautionary tale, a symbol parents used to frighten children into obedience. The memory of your true suffering vanished beneath layers of myth and fear. Your humanity disappeared entirely, replaced by monstrous fictions more convenient than uncomfortable truths. The ritual itself eventually ceased, forgotten as generations passed. The crumbling manor collapsed slowly into ruin, vines overtaking walls, nature reclaiming what men had abandoned. Yet your legend persisted, whispering through village streets long after your name was forgotten. Ironically, you had achieved immortality, not as a woman of flesh and blood, but as a nightmare, an eternal shadow haunting village dreams. People still claimed to see your spectral figure wandering moonlit paths, always leading silent, ghostly girls toward some unseen darkness. They crossed themselves quickly, shivering with primal fear, never understanding the real tragedy behind their superstitions. You had wanted desperately to escape your role, to stop being the woman who led frightened girls into torment. But fate gave you no mercy in life, nor did history grant kindness in death. Instead, you were remembered forever as villain rather than victim, monster rather than martyr. In the end, perhaps it did not matter. You had lived, suffered, endured, and finally died, alone, misunderstood, forgotten as a person, yet remembered vividly as myth. Your life had never truly belonged to you. It belonged instead to a system of cruelty so powerful it outlasted even memory. Yet deep in the forest near your forgotten grave, wildflowers eventually bloomed gently every spring. No villagers ever visited, but birds built nests above, squirrels gathered acorns nearby, and sunlight warmed the soil softly. Nature slowly healed the land, erasing traces of human cruelty with patience and quiet grace. Perhaps, if someone had bothered looking closely enough, they might have noticed the tiny blooms of white lilies marking the spot where your bones lay hidden. Perhaps they might have seen something peaceful there, something quietly forgiving beneath centuries of superstition and fear. But no one ever came close enough to notice. They stayed far away, afraid of the legend, unaware that beneath their fears lay only a woman who had been trapped, used, and forgotten. You had become precisely what your village needed, a dark legend hiding the truth they never wanted to confront. They transformed you into myth to avoid confronting the cruelty they'd enabled. And so you remained forever trapped in their stories, unable to explain or defend yourself, a ghost eternally misunderstood. Yet perhaps somewhere, deep in the forest, beneath gentle sunlight filtering softly through leaves, you finally rested peacefully, freed at last from the burdens of tradition, hatred, and fear. Finally, after all those years of pain and sorrow, you were at peace. Even if no one else ever knew or understood, perhaps that was enough.